Hi, welcome. Today I'm going to be doing a psychological analysis of Harold Shipman. I did cover this case a little while back, however it didn't include many details about his upbringing, so username StarFox requested that I cover it again with a bit more detail. Harold Shipman was a general practitioner and he worked treating patients for the NHS in Hyde, Manchester, and he's thought to have killed mostly elderly patients over a period of the last 20 years. It earned him the title of Britain's most prolific serial killer. In January 2000, a jury found him guilty of murdering 15 patients. However, a 2-year-long inquiry found that he was responsible for the murder of at least 215 people. Shipman killed patients with lethal doses of diamorphine, and then he lied about it on their death certificates to cover up his role in their death. The majority of those that he killed were elderly female patients who were under his care. He was in a position of authority and he was trusted by those he cared for. It'd be impossible to accurately say how many people that he's killed because of the methods that he used in the course of his normal daily activities, as well as the fact that most of his victims were elderly. Just a side note, if you do enjoy this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon so I can continue to bring you this type of content. If you're interested in true crime, psychology or offender profiling, you might enjoy one of my online courses or one of my ebooks, and you can find all of that on my website, which is in the video description. Harold Shipman came from fairly humble origins and was the second of 4 children. His parents were devout Methodists, and there's nothing to suggest that there were any problems or trauma or any difficulties growing up. He was doted on and regarded as the bright child of the family. Shipman was a reasonable student, although not the brightest in his class. He was quiet and he didn't really attract much attention. He got into medical school because he was very bright and he won a scholarship. When Shipman was 17 years old, his mother, aged only 45, died a painful death from cancer. A doctor had administered a morphine injection shortly before she took her last breath. It's been said that he was very close to his mother and was fairly distant with his father. And her death would have undoubtedly been a traumatic time for Shipman. He didn't have too many friends because others saw him as arrogant, tyrannical, and very few people found that they could cope with him. He'd regularly fall out with those who were friends with him, and the only psychiatrist who's examined him called him the ultimate control freak. He had to have everything done the way that he wanted it. Shipman thought that he was better than everybody else, and he was always telling people just how good he was. He met his wife while he was in medical school, and she also came from a very humble background. She was poorly educated, and the general opinion was that she was a fairly dowdy kind of person. She was pregnant and was very quickly married to Shipman. She then started antagonising her parents to such an extent that the family never had anything more to do with them. She was absolutely devoted to him. They went on to have 4 children, and to this day she still gives him unequivocal support. In 1975, Shipman was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, which is also known as Demerol, for his own use. He was fined £600 and he briefly attended a drug rehabilitation clinic in York. His wife supported him throughout his addiction to pethidine and frequently drove him on his rounds because he suffered from blackouts, waiting patiently in the car while he treated his patients. When he was jailed, she moved house to be nearer to him and she visits him as often as she was allowed. Friends say that Shipman was everything to his wife, that she was devoted to him and she was submissive to him. But he was commonly remembered as a moody and domineering person. He's been described by many as forceful, clever, enigmatic, and she was barely literate and highly impressionable. In fact, he was probably attracted to her because of these qualities. Throughout their marriage, Shipman was tyrannical. He wanted and expected to get what he wants when he wants it. The examining psychiatrist said that he would keep the family waiting at the table for mealtimes until 10 o'clock, until he got home. Shipman was absolutely in control, and everybody around him had to do what they were told. He thought he was better than everybody else, and he was always telling people how good he was. Dr. Robert Kaplan has suggested that he treated his patients with this level of contempt. As long as they behaved, as long as they worshipped and appreciated him, he seemed to like them. But at some point, some of his patients must have become a bother, a pest, or were just plain inconvenient, and then he took the obvious step to him from there. Harold Shipman is unusual for a serial killer. Most serial killers are either motivated by sexual gratification or money. However, that doesn't seem to be the case with Shipman. He did forge the will of one victim to financially benefit himself, but that was an isolated incident. Various psychiatrists, psychologists, and other academics have proposed theories on why he killed. While he was in jail, Shipman wrote to two of his friends, Mavis and David Scott, and these letters have since been analysed. In these letters, Shipman writes about how the police think that he's boring because he doesn't have a mistress, he doesn't have a home abroad or money in offshore bank accounts. He also wrote about how nobody had seen him committing the crimes or stealing the drugs. A psychologist named Dr. David Holmes said that the content of these letters suggested that Shipman was enjoying the attention that he received. Dr. Holmes also said that Shipman saw himself as superior to everyone else and that in his eyes he was some sort of a medical god. A psychotherapist named Mavis Clean wrote that she thought that his mother's death was a motivating factor to his killings. Klein suggests that his lifelong motivation was to free himself of the trauma of his mother's death by rewriting his personal history. His gentle, painless killing of his elderly female patients, she said, were all bids to make his mother die less painfully. Klein went on to say that she believes that the relatively few male patients that he'd murdered were stand-ins for himself in a subsidiary bid to end his own suffering. His undisputed kindness and gentleness as a GP were an admirable way in which he sought to cancel his mother's agony. However, a number of other professionals have disagreed with this suggestion. All of the professionals who've commented on this case have all agreed that Shipman is a narcissistic control freak who enjoyed the power and control that he was able to have as a GP. It's widely acknowledged that Harold Shipman was extremely arrogant and he saw himself as superior to everybody else. I believe that this, combined with the controlling narcissism, is the driving force behind his behaviour. It's a neat and tidy idea that somehow the driving force to his killing was his mother, to end his mother's suffering or to end the suffering of the elderly patients because of what his mum went through. However, it doesn't explain why he dedicated years of his life to medical school to become a doctor. There are many individuals who go through traumatic events and don't go on to kill over 200 people. Some psychologists have speculated that his mother's death could have been a source of his morbid fascination in older women. On the day that his mother died, he went for a long run. An unusual act in bereavement. However, people can grieve in different ways. Another psychologist or psychiatrist might comment on how this was him running away from having to deal with the grief or the trauma that he felt, or breaking free from the pain of having to watch his mother suffer. However, it is clear that Harold Shipman had a very high sense of self-importance, and this was evident in the way that he spoke to people, including the officers who interviewed him about the deaths. Shipman was initially being investigated for the forgery of the will. He'd tricked one of his patients into signing a will and two others into signing as a witness for the will. All of those who'd signed would believe that they were signing a medical consent form. However, even before this, another GP had raised concerns to the police of the high number of deaths from his surgery. Inspector Stan Edgerton, who was the senior investigating officer, said that Shipman was extremely arrogant. He said that Shipman made it plainly obvious that Edgerton was nowhere near his intellectual equal. The inspector said that Shipman had tried to take control of the interview and was trying to lead officers' questions or not answer them at all. The senior policeman in charge of the case deliberately then handed over the interview to two less experienced officers, one of which was a woman. Shipman stared at the female officer throughout the interview in an extremely condescending way. Shipman was then presented with undeniable evidence that he'd been involved in the murders. Shipman's solicitor asks for a private consultation with his client at that point. And it was at that point that Shipman broke down in tears. And these were very unlikely to have been tears of remorse or regret. The more likely explanation is that these were tears of frustration. Shipman had always been used to others treating him as an authority figure, and he enjoyed being held in high regard and treated with respect. Psychiatrists who've examined Shipman while he was awaiting trial came to the conclusion that his killings were an example of classic necrophilia. The condition takes many more forms than simply having the desire to have sex with a corpse. Some sufferers simply take pleasure from being in the presence of death. Several of Shipman's lists, such as his love of order and of lists, do fit in with this theory. Necrophiliacs often immerse themselves in the inanimate world, replacing love for people with the love of things. Gerard Bales, a consultant psychologist of East Anglia Regional Forensic Science Services, said narcissism would probably be an important factor in his motivation. He considers himself important, but everyone else is not. He went on to say they can't see that they've done anything wrong, and the more you confront them with what they did, the more likely they blame other factors. The majority of serial killers take some sort of memento from their crimes, and Shipman is no different. These items help the killer to relive the sense of excitement or the power that they had at the time of killing. Gems stolen by Harold Shipman from his elderly victims were found in a jewellery box in the couple's bedroom. His wife Primrose had asked for 100 items, which were estimated to be worth £10,000, to be returned to her after they were seized by the police and her husband's arrest. Mrs. Shipman was able to prove that 66 of those items were her own. But she's now told police that 34 items in the box in her bedroom didn't belong to her. During Shipman's trial, Primrose, his wife, queued for food with family members of the victims during the breaks in the trial, and she tried to even make small talk with the victims' relatives. After his conviction, she lived in almost total isolation, cutting herself off from any friends or family who didn't take the view that her husband was harmless. It's likely that she really does believe that he's innocent. Finding out that your lover, who you adore, is a fraudster means that your original picture of them then becomes threatened. And this can create a lot of stress and pain in people. To restore harmony, our mind simply deletes the bits of information that it finds too uncomfortable to deal with. In conclusion then, Harold Shipman was a very controlling person who saw himself as very superior to others. He believed that he was so intelligent he was never going to get caught for his crimes. He most likely killed because he enjoyed the sense of power and control that it gave him. He is unlikely to have seen or acknowledged his victims as people, as unique individuals. He's more likely to have seen them as an object to be controlled and manipulated and then disposed of as he saw fit. Because of the way Shipman administered morphine injections and issued death certificates, much of Britain's legal structure concerning healthcare and medicine was then reviewed and modified. Shipman is the only British doctor to have been found guilty of murdering his patients, although other doctors have been accused but been acquitted of similar crimes or convicted on lesser charges. In one final show of control, Shipman killed himself by hanging himself in his cell at HMP Wakefield in 2004. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you found it interesting, and as always, more importantly, I hope that you've learned something new from it. Thanks for watching then. See you next week. Bye for now.